Welcome to a new episode of Insight Interviews of the Shia Research Institute. And I am Sajjad Rizvi, Professor of Islamic Intellectual History at the University of Exeter in England. Today we're going to be in conversation with Professor Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmad, who is the Prophet Muhammad University Professor of Shia Studies at Florida International University. And we'll be talking about his research and future plans that he has for publications. So welcome,
Thank
Nizamuddin.
you. Shukran.
And
Pleasure to be here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely.
I guess the obvious place to start is if you could just tell me a bit about your research journey and how it is that you came to work on Ibn Arabi in particular, and then we'll kind of take things beyond that.
That's a very interesting story, if I may be so bold to say that. It also intersects with my own personal spiritual journey as well. I was always fascinated by the spiritual path, irfan, tasawwuf. Growing up, my late father, rahimahullah, was involved in Sufism. Although I didn't really learn that until I was, fully, I think I was in my 20s when I found that out. He was very low profile about it. And when I was actually at university as an undergrad, and my undergraduate was actually in mathematics, I became very interested in philosophy. And I started reading some Western philosophers. And I didn't really find them to be too interesting, honestly. I suppose the reason was I started with Nietzsche.
Right, that's probably not the way you
Well,
should start.
I quite enjoyed his The Antichrist, which of course is a polemic against Christianity, and very readable book. But I was more interested in metaphysical questions, and so I wanted to read people like Avicenna, but there really wasn't a lot available, except for at that time was Parviz Marawij's Metaphysica and things like this. And to make a long story short, I'd always heard about Al-Shaykh al-Akbar wal-Kibrit al-Ahmar, the greatest, the Dr. Maximus, the greatest sheikh, and the red sulfur, this alchemical term. And I came across a translation of his Bezels of Wisdom, Fusus Al-Hikam, in the Classics Western Spirituality series published by Paulist Press, a Catholic publication house. And that was the Austin translation. And I was still an undergraduate at the time. I was sort of in the middle of my undergraduate career at Purdue University. And I started reading that in translation, but I had, while growing up, I had spent a number of years in Saudi Arabia because my father was a professor of sociology there at King Abdulaziz University. And so I had an understanding of Arabic. And when I was reading that, I was like, what is the original Arabic here? When he says, the absolute, does he say Allah? Does he say Al-Haq? Does he say,
Yeah.
So this was back in the day. So I got a copy of the Fusus Al-Hikam in Arabic through interlibrary loan. This is before internet and all that. I mean, the internet existed, but not like now.
Yeah.
And that was the Afifi edition, and I started reading that and sort of deepening my understanding of Arabic beyond a merely sort of rudimentary level, and that's how I really got interested in Ibn Arabi. And so eventually, I got my degrees, finished my math degree, went on to study Arabic at Indiana University, and became, I was really in quest of the works of Ibn Arabi.
Right.
I really wanted to read the Futuhat and things. And there were a lot of different currents in the Muslim world at the time, and Islam in America, and you would hear about the different people who would sort of name drop Ibn Arabi, but they really didn't know what he was about. And so that's what really drew me to Ibn Arabi.
Yeah.
I would really say that was the reason I learned Arabic.
Right.
I mean, there were other reasons, but he was a major factor.
Well, that's a serious motivation because it's difficult reading Ibn Arabi in Arabic.
It's very difficult reading Ibn Arabi, but I received a lot of encouragement because after my stint at Purdue and I got my bachelor's, I went to Indiana University and started doing my Arabic. And at the time, the person who really helped me there a lot was Victor Danner when it came to Ibn Arabi. I didn't take Arabic classes with him. I took Arabic classes with Suzanne Stetkevich.
Yeah.
But Victor Danner was very interested in Ibn Arabi. He'd spent time in Morocco. His Arabic was fantastic. And he knew a lot about the Fusus, the Futuhat, and many other things. And so that sort of got me started. And so many years later, when I was doing further Arabic studies in Cairo, I found out that there was supposed to be an autographed manuscript of the Fusus Al-Hikam in Turkey, in Konya. And the Afifi edition is not based on that. It's based on some very much later, not very good manuscripts in my view. And so I always wondered about this. And the person who made that statement was actually Uthman Yahya, who is a Syrian scholar who basically he became Shi'i. But he was Ismaili. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, from Syrian Ismaili background.
So he was actually living in Cairo at the Dominican Institute, and then I ended up taking a class with, arranging a private class with him. And he says that this manuscript is there in Konya. So fast forward many years later, I'm teaching at American University in Cairo, and I go to Cairo in the summer of 2009 to look for this manuscript. And I go to Konya, and I ask people, and we went to different places, and I assumed it would be in the library of Jalaluddin Rumi, which is, it's actually called a museum, Mevlana Muzesi. And so I went there, and oddly enough, the catalog there was by a Shi'i scholar, Abdul Baqi Gülpenadle.
Yeah.
And so I went through the whole catalog there, and I didn't find any mention of it, and I asked people, and nobody knew anything about this. So then I had a Turkish friend who knew this elderly chap who was involved in manuscript research, and we went to see him at his house. And after we had some excellent ice cream, dondurmas, he said, no, it's actually in Istanbul. I said, really? He said, yeah, it's in the Turk Islam Eserleri Müzesi, and I was living around the corner. So ultimately we get a hold of the manuscript, and it's actually not the autograph of Ibn Arabi, what it actually is. And this is the critical edition that ultimately resulted from that.
Yeah, what you produced,
the one which I worked on. It's actually in the handwriting of his disciple, Sadruddin Qunawi, who dies around the same time as Nasiruddin al-Tusi. And we need to talk about Tusi. 672. We'll Hijrah 1274, I think.
1274.
So it's in his handwriting, but on the first folio, there is a, in the handwriting of Ibn Arabi, he basically says that Sadruddin has read this book back to me, and I give him an ijazah for it. And I think someone later sort of circles it and puts it like in a balloon, so to speak. And that is definitely in the handwriting of Ibn Arabi. So that's the whole story behind it. And I wanted to just produce an edition that was based on that. And that also had, originally it was my aim to, to put the different commentaries in the margins. But in the end, what I ended up doing was going with the commentary by Qaisari, which is much later. But it's probably the most voluminous and most widely read, especially in the Shi'i world. Kashani seems to be more in circulation among the Sunnis, or at least in the Sunni world. Oddly enough, Kashani was Shi'i. Qaisari was Sunni. Anyhow, so I ended up putting in something like 600 or 700 footnotes, glosses on the text, in which I put in the full tashkil. In Urdu, we would say ʿArab, pure ʿArab lagaye, but we put in the full tashkil. And sometimes you have to make decisions. And so I'd always look at Qaisari. In one or two instances, I looked at Kashani. But that was the whole motivation. And it was a very, very inspiring thing. Because you really don't, it's very different when you read a book out loud. So I had someone who was helping me, Ustaz Ahmad Sultan, who was a Hassanid Sharif, who was actually my calligraphy teacher in Cairo. And we worked together. And sometimes I would read back and he would read back and we would check. And it's very different when you read a text out loud. And I think the habits of reading have also changed in the modern world. I think in the medieval times, people would read, quietly. There was a kind of a sub-vocalizing that would take place. And you see this, like when people read like the Quran and they rock back and forth. And so we don't really do that. I think silent reading is a new phenomenon. And when you read it out loud,
no reading at all.
Or no reading. No, but there's a book called The History of Reading by the Spanish guy, or this guy writes in Spanish. Manuel.
Yeah.
So that's a fascinating book.
Yeah, it is. It's a very good book.
So it's a whole different experience. And Ibn Arabi came alive for me in a completely different way as a result of that experience. So,
well, I guess we should really say something a bit more about what the Fusus is.
Yes.
And its reception then. So if you could say a bit more about what the text is and what its significance is, how it's received.
Well, the Fusus Al-Hikam is an extremely concentrated work of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. And because it's so short, people think it's accessible because they would rather read something that's about 100 odd pages without any apparatus. That's about what it would be. The manuscript is about 80 folios. As opposed to reading about 5,000 pages of the Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah.
Yes.
Now, oddly enough, some passages in the Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah are very readable, but most of the Fusus is, I would not say, an easy read. I don't think there's a single sentence I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that is crystal clear.
I remember doing the introduction of the Fusus with students and making them cry.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't make sense of anything.
There are passages of an exceedingly and almost runic obscurity, almost a kind of, oracular sayings in some regards as well. So it's a very difficult text. Ibn al-Arabi was a master of the Arabic language, and, it's actually in 27 chapters, but if you include the opening, the exordium or the khutbah, the opening discourse, then it would be 28. And 28 is very important. I don't think we'll be able to get into all this, but there is a symbolism that goes with the letters of the Arabic alphabet, because there's 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. And the letters are very important for Ibn al-Arabi. But let's put that on the side for the moment. So each of the 27 chapters is associated with a particular prophet. So Fusus Al-Hikam means the bezels of wisdom. And so the bezel, I don't have one on this watch, but like some watches, they have a bezel which moves or rotates, or like on a ring like this. That can also be the fuss. So this ring doesn't have anything. It's flat, it's silver, but it has some writing on it. Some rings in the lore of rings in the Islamic world, they'll have a gemstone, and there maybe even be writing on the gemstone.
So like that.
Like yours, yeah. So this concept of the fuss, or the gemstone, or the ringstone, or the bezel is a symbol, if you look into the various commentaries, of the heart of a particular prophet.
Right.
And so each of these more or less Quranic prophets symbolizes a particular wisdom which goes with a certain divine name or names. And it's interesting because Qaysari will tell you what the divine names are. There's associated. And I say more or less Quranic prophets because all of them are mentioned in the Quran except for chapter 26, which is the so-called extra-canonic prophet Khalid ibn Sinan. And he is mentioned in both Sunni and Shi'i hadith tradition as being a prophet in the fatra, in the period in between, the prophet before and the coming of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And actually, I talk about that in the appendices to my edition. So each of these prophets then symbolizes a particular wisdom, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is distinguished as being the complete and total embodiment of all the divine names in actuality. In act, not bil fi'l.
Yes.
Not bil quwwa. Whereas if you read the first chapter, which is the symbolism of Adam, the wisdom of divinity in the word of Adam, fasur hikmatin ilahiyatin fi kalimatin adamiyya. That's Adam as primordial humanity. And in that sense, that each human being has in potentia, bil quwwa, these divine names. And then, of course, it depends on that individual to actualize those divine names in their life and so forth. But no one has all of the words, as the Prophet ﷺ said, "Utitu jawami' al-kalim." So in that sense, then, the Fusus, I think, can be seen as a kind of extended commentary on the concept, an exceedingly important concept of al-insanul kamil, or the perfect man. And of course, there's other ideas. So the other key idea associated with Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, of course, is wahdatul wujud. Although most people say he never actually used this phrase. This phrase comes through the commentators, but he actually has phrases close to it in the Futuhat. And all of those citations are in Professor Jahangiri's work on Ibn al-Arabi. I forget the title in Persian. I actually have the Arabic translation. You might, do you remember the Persian title?
No, I don't.
So there's an Alay Jahangiri who has this important work on Ibn al-Arabi.
Mohsin Jahangiri.
I think so, yeah. So there's the doctrine of wahdatul wujud, of the unicity of being. And then there, of course, is the notion or the teaching of how the universe is the theophany of the divine names. And then, of course, there's al-insan al-kamil, or the perfect man. And then there's also the doctrine of al-a'yan al-thabita, or it's very hard to translate, the fixed entities, or but ayn, it means eye, it means well, but it really means a source. Yeah. So it's more like the source forms, or if you like, the source ideas. It's very much, I think, the Akbari or Ibn Arabian version, if you like, of the Platonic ideas or the Platonic forms. Yeah. And there's a lot more that could be said there, but I think that is really what the Fusus is about. But there is a lot of symbolism in this book, and the symbolism cannot be translated. And the Fusus is written for a very learned audience, but I don't mean learned in the sense of al-ilm al-husuli only, just a didactic kind of knowledge,
but more experiential, more kind of you've actually done it. Yeah,
exactly. But even more so, the actual sort of didactic learning that goes there is for the person who is thoroughly grounded in the Quran. Yeah. If you're not grounded in the Quran, you won't see it. I mean, even and he has all sorts of iqtibasat, sort of like little quotes from the Quran, which he incorporates seamlessly into his speech, but you won't know unless you've read the Quran. So like in the opening khutbah, he talks about bilqil al-aqwam. Well, that's a reference to Surah Muzammil. Right. But you have to know. Yeah. And he does the same with hadith, because in the manuscript, in the time of the hand-produced book, there's no critical apparatus. There's no editor. If he just says, "Kuntu nabiyyan wa Adamu bayna al-ma'i wa tin," I was a prophet when Adam was between water and clay. That's a hadith. Yeah. Well, you have to know that's, and he's saying it is, but he's not going to tell you where it is. Yeah. You're expected to know. So it is for a sort of learned readership. And the truly astonishing thing is just how far this book has traveled in the Muslim world. I don't think there is a single Muslim manuscript library, of course the really big ones, but even private libraries, that does not have at least one copy from some period of the Fusus. And there were hundreds of commentaries in Arabic, in Persian, in Turkish, in Chagatai, translations, versions in Urdu, paraphrased versions in classical Chinese. So this book was very widely read, but it wasn't very deeply read. I don't think it was read by everyone in society, but it was very widely diffused as a text. But then the ideas are diffused through literature.
Yes, poetry in particular. Yeah.
Poetry in particular. And I think some fascinating stuff happened because when Muhyiddin al-Arabi was in Anatolia, and he took Sadruddin Qunawi under his wing as his disciple, as his stepson as well. Sadruddin really becomes this great commentator, and he was thoroughly grounded in the traditional Islamic disciplines, including hadith. He's a great scholar of hadith. Yeah. But also in the philosophy of Avicenna. And he also knew Jalaluddin Rumi. Yes. And he's the first commentator on the Fusus. And he meets, Fakhruddin Iraqi, comes there and attends these classes on the Fusus, and he writes the text in Persian, the Lama'at. And that's a kind of further development of the notion of what is later they called Mazhab-e-Ishq in Persian. But it's there in Ahmad al-Ghazali, early on, the sort of, elaborate sort of love poetry, Ishq poetry. And it's there in the Lama'at. And then it goes on, from there, and sort of erupts in people like Hafiz. But it's there also in a text like Gulshan-e-Raz. I mean, all of these ideas are there, and that permeates through society, and especially in South Asia, is found in the Qawwali tradition.
Of course, yeah.
And the other sort of popular Sufi traditions, which survive throughout the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent today, and are particularly strong, I think, in Punjab, Multan, these areas.
Yeah, that's amongst with the Sarawardis, you have the early reception of the Lama'at. Yeah. And then, of course, with the Chishtis, and even with the Naqshbandis, you have the formal commentaries on the Fusus.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that gives us a sense of the broader impact and reception. What about the specific Shi'i reception?
That's really interesting, because I was really surprised when I first went to study in Cairo. I arrived in Cairo a few months shy of my 25th birthday, I think. Yeah, that's right. And began my studies of Arabic there after Indiana University at American University in Cairo, part of what was called the CASA program, Center for Arabic Study Abroad. And I was surprised that the only real sharh you could find was a terrible edition of Al-Kashani. And
I remember buying a very bad copy of that from Maidan al-Azhar many years ago.
Was it Maidan al-Azhar or was it Maktab al-Sabayh?
It was almost like a stall in Maidan al-Azhar or something.
So the Maidan al-Azhar they would sell there, then there was a Maktab al-Sabayh, and then there was, there's all these little bookshops around there.
It looked like it'd been stapled.
Yeah, it was very bad. And there was an earlier one which goes all the way back to the Bulaq days, Al-Matba al-Amiriyya, and I think that was published in 13 something of the Hijrah, 1311. Yeah. No, it's not. There's a lithograph. Yes, you're right. You are quite right. There's a lithograph, and then later there is a movable type.
Yeah, which would have been probably maybe 1910s or so.
Yeah, I have both of those now. But the edition of Kashani, which I was familiar with at Indiana University Bloomington, was the movable type version, which is what Izutsu cites throughout his book Sufism and Taoism. Yeah. But it seemed that in the Sunni world, you would only find Kashani. I knew there was a commentary by Al-Jandi, can't get it. I knew there was a commentary by Qaisari, not available. All of them are published in Iran, available in Iran. And this I always thought to be very, very odd. Why is it? And, important figures have been fascinated by it. I mean, Allama Tabatabai, important contemporary figure. Yeah. And of course, the very famous name for other reasons as well, Ayatollah Ruhollah al-Khomeini.
Yeah, of course.
Right? He was a commentator. He has glosses. Jalaluddin Ashtiani, who's a close disciple of al-Khomeini as well. These guys are very interested in Arabi, and it really begs the question, why? Now, I think there are a number of reasons for this. The most obvious one is that there's a tremendous resonance with the doctrine of the Imam.
Yeah. Insan Kamil and the Imam.
The perfect man, exactly, and the Imam. And that goes for 12er Shi'is as well as your Ismaili Shi'is as well. The Zaydis, of course, have a completely different, they don't have that notion of the Imam, of Isma and being in and all this. So I think that Ibn al-Arabi's doctrine of al-Insan al-Kamil is functionally equivalent, I would argue, to that of the doctrine of the Imam. And you see also a movement in this direction in Falsafa. So, of course, the tradition of Avicenna is very important, Ibn Sina, also for the Shia world. And that's another question, why is that? But let's leave that aside.
Yeah.
But I think there's an extremely, extremely interesting passage at the very end of the encyclopedic work, Kitab al-Shifa. Right? So the Shifa is this encyclopedic work. You've got logic, you've got geometry, arithmetic, music,
natural philosophy.
The whole thing, natural philosophy, psychology, the soul. Although that part never got published.
The Dayanamur is published.
No, it didn't get published in the Cairo edition because Fazlur Rahman didn't like what there, and then he published it at like the University of Durham or something.
Yes, Oxford.
So did that ever come out separately? It hasn't.
I have it somewhere.
Yeah, okay, I need that. So that's a footnote.
I definitely have it. I mean, and there actually are two other editions of the
Okay, we need to talk about that afterwards. So then you go all the way to the Ilahiyat, the metaphysics. So here we are. He's talking about wujud and mahiyya and the usual stuff, existence, quiddity, substance, accident, etc., etc., etc. The very last part is about the philosopher king.
Yeah.
And the very last sentence, he says he says, yakadu an yakuna, I think, rabban insaniyan. I think that's what he says. I don't know, something to that effect. That he in effect becomes a human sort of god.
Yeah.
That's a very strong statement. So that also is I think in an imami vein, and I don't accept the idea that Ibn Sina was some sort of a Hanafi or something that the Gutas and the Gutasiyya believe in.
I mean, he was trained in Hanafi fiqh, but
I was trained in
certainly,
Hanafi fiqh.
yeah.
What does that prove?
But I mean, certainly the account of the Prophet is not kind of a straightforward traditional Sunni consideration.
It's not.
And the account of the ruler definitely sounds like the Imam.
It definitely sounds like the Imam. And you have the same sort of stuff in al-Farabi, in Ara al-Madinat al-Fadila. You have similar idea in Suhrawardi. And of course, all of this stuff and Ibn al-Arabi sort of comes together where?
Yeah.
It comes together much later in Mullah Sadra. And I think, again, that's a major reason for people like Allama Tabatabai and Khomeini and so, because they were also part of this whole transcendent wisdom or al-Hikmat al-Muta'aliyah school. Yeah. Right? So I think that notion of the Imam, which is there in philosophy as well, and which is there in Ibn Arabi, and which is there in the Ishraqi, in al-Hikmat al-Ishraq as well, about the Qayyim al-Kitab, is the one who upholds the book, as it were, in Shi'ab al-Surwari al-Maqtul. So I think all of that comes together, but I think that the key figure here, and this we'll move nicely into our other topic if you like, but I am going to mention him at this point. I really think that the Hamzat al-Wasl here, the glottal stop that joins, so to speak, right? I mean, it works better in Arabic. Sort of the connection here, in the link in the chain, so to speak, is none other than Nasiruddin al-Tusi. Right. Now, the reason I say this is because, again, it goes back to Sadruddin Qunawi, because just like Fakhruddin Iraqi is a very important link in the transmission of Akbari doctrines in the wider Iran Zamin, the Persian, cultural sphere. Yeah. Nasiruddin al-Tusi didn't meet him in person, but they had an absolutely crucial correspondence. Yes. Which there's two editions. There's the Khajavi edition, and then there's the one through the Orient Institute, the Helmut Ritter people, by was it Gedrun Schubert?
Yeah, Schubert. Yeah, not Kramer. Schubert.
I hope I'm not mispronouncing. But anyway, it's something G. Schubert.
It's Gudrun Schubert.
Gudrun Schubert, right?
Yeah.
So that's very important. Madlung wrote something about it in that there was that anthology on Tusi that came called Donishmand de Tus by Nasrullah Purjawadi. There's an article by Madlung in there. There's one by Landolt in there. Yeah. Chittick never edited, but he talked about it in one of his papers back in the day. It's a very important correspondence. And the weird thing is that Nasiruddin al-Tusi, I don't know if this is just the kind of hyperbolic language which was, very de rigueur in correspondence of this sort, but he's referring to, Sadruddin as the Imam, which I think is just really over the top. But obviously he really respects him. Now, whether that's just ta'aruf or what, I really couldn't tell you. But the correspondence is quite interesting. And essentially, Sadruddin is sending him a treatise, which is called Al-Risalat al-Mufsiha. Yeah. And then he accidentally appends something else there, and then he later apologizes to one of his students, like, it's sort of like today when you're sending an email attachment, you attach something else by accident. And so he apologizes for that part, but in Risalat al-Mufsiha, he's basically arguing that you can't really know haqa'iq al-ashya through mere conceptual elaborations and rational demonstrations and so forth, that there must be a kashf, an unveiling. Yeah. So, when we pray, Allahumma arina haqa'iq al-ashya kama hiya, which is a constant refrain among falasifa and urafa, oh Allah, show us the reality of things as they are. It's supposed to be a dua of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah. He's saying you can't get there. And he's asking, among many other things, there's a bunch of questions, Nasiruddin al-Tusi to sort of give his view, ibda' al-ra'yi, to make known his opinion on this matter. And he even invokes the authority of Ibn Sina, saying, Ibn Sina also said, you really can't, but Tusi comes back and says, no, you've not really read this properly. And what Ibn Sina really meant is that you can't really know the reality of things in terms of their definition and their tashakhus and their individuation. He didn't really mean you can't know intelligibles, ma'qulat. And so they sort of go back and forth on sort of minor points like this. But the whole point, it's very clear if you read the correspondence. And also this is argued by Madlung and Landolt as well, although Landolt wants to see a kind of Ismaili angle. That Tusi also recognizes that there is something beyond Burhan. And that is also there, of course, in Ibn Sina at the end of the Isharat, the last part of the Isharat, and of course in the commentary of Nasiruddin al-Tusi is on that. It also comes out. And of course they also talk about wujud.
Yes. What does wujud mutlaq mean?
What does wujud mutlaq mean? What does, absolute existence or the absolute being mean? And it's a fascinating correspondence, and I think maybe someone should do an English translation. It's something maybe we should work on.
And actually it's foundational for the later debate between Sufis and philosophers. Because the whole debate about wujud mutlaq, which is kind of rehearsed again and again, for all the way from 14th century to the 17th century, is all based actually on principles which are laid out in that correspondence already.
Absolutely right. So I think that was a kind of link or a turning point. It's a link in the chain and it's a turning point. Because a lot of those ideas make it into the Tajrid al-I'tiqad.
Yeah.
And of course the commentary, the Kashf al-Murad by al-Allam al-Hilli, this pivotal work of 12 Shi'a theology by Nasiruddin al-Tusi.
Before we get on to Tusi and the Tajrid and all that.
Sure.
Sure. I mean, one last thing on the kind of the Shi'a
please
reception of Ibn Arabi. I mean, it's striking that out of all of the commentaries on the Fusus, as far as I can remember, there's only really one which is Shi'a, and that's Sayyid Haidar.
Well, don't you count Kashani to be Shi'a?
Yeah, Kashani, yes, but Kashani is not kind of explicitly that Shi'a in the commentary.
So you're stepping out of that because we've got Sadruddin Qunawi, which isn't a line by line, it's a thematic commentary. Then the real commentary is Al-Jandi, then Kashani, then Qaisari, and that's sort of the
but even if you go
so
later and look in ʿArabi, there's Muhibb al-Ilabadi, I mean, there's so many other commentaries. But I mean, the only one from what I remember which is very explicitly Shi'a is Haidar Amali.
Right.
And I guess, I mean, they're all kind of like super commentaries. So, for example, Ali Nouri's famous super commentary on Ibn Turka's Fusus Al-Hikam is a very Shi'a
Isn't
text.
Ibn Turka Shi'i?
The Ibn Turka commentary, I think, is more lettrist than Shi'a.
It's so lettrist. Yeah.
But the Hashia by Ali Nouri is lettrist and Shi'a. But it does. I mean, like there's a huge reception, and there is the obvious point that the Qaisari text becomes like a seminary text which everyone studies. Now, when that happened exactly, that's an interesting question. But we certainly know that by the mid Qajar period at the very least, so roughly in the middle of the 19th century, the Sharh Fusus of Qaisari was being studied in the seminary in Iran. And at the same time, you have other texts which are being adopted, like the Tamhid al-Qawaid of Ibn Turka and other texts.
Yeah, that's an important book.
Yeah, which is seen as kind of like a fellow traveler in a sense. That text is seen as a complementary one. And then, of course, you've got the Misbah al-Uns as well, which is also seen as kind of a So,
I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, why that is, but I just, as an aside or a footnote, I would like to say that lettrism, I really don't use that term, but fine.
Ilm
al-Huruf, but I would say Ilm al-Jafr.
Yeah.
So if you want to speak of lettrism or Jafr, I think it is already Shi'i. I don't really think that there's a genuinely Sunni lettrism, or I really don't. I think it's Shi'i in its origin. I think all the roots of esotericism in Islam all go back to Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Ahlul Bayt, and I think
that's quite explicit.
That's just a fact.
Pretty much, yeah. I think everyone would say that. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that I mean, certainly in the modern period, the question of Ibn Arabi and Tashayyu becomes a controversial one.
It's very controversial, yeah.
But in some ways, the kind of the culmination of this tradition. I mean, there's lots of texts, like one which I was just looking at the other day, speaking to a friend Reza Shah Kazemi, was Miftar Asrar Hosseini, So Miftar al-Asrar al-Husseini is this text by 18th century Nur Bakhshi Sufi, who writes this text sitting in the Haram in Karbala, of Haram of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And the whole thing is heavily influenced by Ibn Arabi. It's the whole schematic nature of it. But of course, for him, in the direct sense, the Insan Kamil he's dealing with is Imam Hussein.
Yeah.
So, and there are many, many other texts which have that reflection, even though they're not directly commenting on the Fusus. But in some ways, the interesting kind of culmination of that process, especially within circles of what you might call Sufi orders, is Husseini Tehrani, right? So say Muhammad Husseini Tehrani's Ruh Mujarrad, this famous
It's
text,
a very
which was
important book.
first published in the early 90s.
Yeah.
As you know, has about 100 odd pages where he's trying to establish that Ibn Arabi himself was Shi'i.
That's right. I have read this work, and you are right. It is about 100 pages.
Why do we suddenly get to this bit where it's not just the reception, but it's like, no, actually he was Shi'i. That's why we should be engaging with this.
Well, I've dealt with this at length in my paper presented at that symposium, the first symposium of the Shia Institute back in the day, and you and I edited that volume together, and it's called
but it
Imam
requires
by any other name would smell as sweet.
Extensive article.
All right, but I would say that Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi was not a Shi'i in the sense that he had some secret room in his house in Syria where he had a tabut and an alam and a...
No. I mean, that wouldn't have been part of the tradition.
It wouldn't have been part of the tradition. So I am being a bit facetious when I say it, but he's not like some crypto Shi'i who's, hiding in it, I don't think so. No. I really don't. At the same time, he has a number of opinions. Which are in line with Shi'i opinions. He thinks that Hayya ala khair al-amal is part of the adhan. And this is the kind of stuff that these guys quote. Yeah. Who want to argue for the Shi'i affiliation of Ibn al-Arabi. But there's an interesting passage.
And then you have the Khatm al-Awliya sort of...
You have the Khatm al-Awliya problem, and that I also dealt with in the paper. Yeah. I don't know if I agree with that argument completely. What's that work? Al-Fusus Shithi. Who's the author? I forget the name of the author now.
Hassan Zadeh Amuli.
Yeah, no, he didn't write that.
Oh, you mean
Fusus Shithi.
Mawza Qomshehi.
Yes.
Mawza Qomshehi. Who was, of course, a famous teacher of Qaisari.
I summarize his arguments in that paper. I'm not sure I'm convinced, but you can make the argument that he doesn't really claim to be that.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting passage in Avicenna and the Visionary Recital by Korban, in which Korban tries to talk about the affiliation of Avicenna.
Yeah.
And he says something to the effect about how you can't really reduce a person to an index card. And, I quote that in Imam made by any other name would smell as sweet. And then I say, well, if you just replace the name Avicenna with Ibn Arabi, I think it applies here. Yeah. He's an exceedingly complex individual. You can't really reduce him to a category of Sunni or Shia. He certainly doesn't fit completely in either. And I think it's for this reason that he resonates just across the Islamic world.
Right.
And there are things which I don't agree with in Ibn Arabi. But I think that overall his understanding of metaphysics is something which very much resonated. And again, with a figure like Nasiruddin al-Tusi, a lot of those ideas through his obviously his own philosophical research, but his very crucial correspondence with Sadruddin al-Qunwi make it into the more than half of the tajreed, I think, because the first and second parts are just metaphysics. Yeah. You could, in my translation, I call it the abstracta theologica, tajreed ul-i'tiqad, but it's not really theology in the sense that you have kalam theology in the Sunni world. It's more, if we put it in modern terms, they say it's natural theology. Right? Without recourse to scripture and all this, it's just reasoning. Yeah. And anyway, you said when we get we'll get to Tusi when we get to him. But so I think that Ibn al-Arabi, is still very important for the modern world. But he remains a controversial figure in the Sunni world. There's no age passes without many condemnations of the man, and that continues today. But he's also condemned in Shia circles. There's a very famous video of Ishaq Fayaz, Ayatollah al-Uzma Ishaq Fayaz, circulating, in which he denounced Ibn Arabi and Sayyid al-Fusus. But that's almost sort of the default position of most of the Maraji Taqlid.
I mean, it's like
right.
That famous text by Sayyid Ja'far Murtada al-Amili, where the book is called something like Ibn Arabi Sunni Muta'assib.
Fine. So
that's actually the title of the book.
Right.
So I mean, but that gives you a sense of what that polemic is like.
Well, it's not just Ibn Arabi; it's also Mullah Sadr. They're all together because you know better than me that the person that Mullah Sadr quotes the most in the Aswar is Ibn Arabi, and sometimes he just sort of lifts stuff entirely, doesn't he, from Ibn Arabi?
And I mean that kind of, the famous late 18th century version of that polemic is the the back and forth between Sayyid Ali and Sayyid Ali Akbar Shah Maududi.
So Ali Akbar Shah Maududi
and they trade the names. So they like say, Maududi says yes, but what about Sayyid Haidar Amli? What about Kashani? What about Mullah Sadr? He says, names these names, and then of course with Sayyid Ali, these guys are all like, beyond the pale.
Dildar Ali changed after he went to the Atabat. He sort of becomes socialized into the sociology of knowledge here, socialized into the usuli position, and then comes and says, because Maududi was leading the prayers. He was leading the Jummah prayers. He was a very important figure, and so it becomes this whole power struggle then. But that's another whole debate. But you can't help but think that there's a dimension of that, if I may be so bold. Even today, because there's a contestation, isn't it? It's about authority. So if you acknowledge this, so if this is possible, if people have access to this profound spiritual knowledge, then what does that do for the niyaba amma, and the guardian? And if you're on the walayat al-faqih bandwagon, and if you are, that's fine. That's a whole other discussion.
It's an opinion,
right? It's an opinion that's been argued in law. Right, so fine, and it goes with that as well. Although in that context, maybe there's some notion that the jurisconsult or the wali faqih is some sort of philosopher king. But the point is, there is a contestation for a kind of authority, isn't it? So it comes down to, well, is it going to be the person who is accomplished in the study of Rasail al-Maqasid and the works of Shaykh al-Ansari and Akhund al-Khurasani, Kifayat al-Usul, and the whole Usul al-Fiqh and al-Fiqh complex, or is it the Pir Tariqat? Who claims that he has direct access to this knowledge through kashf and shuhud? That's a major question, isn't it?
And it's very difficult for actually the two to kind of coincide in the same individual.
I think the famous individual who at least I think it coincided in to some degree, to a great degree, would have been Khomeini. I mean, he could have pulled, he kind of pulled it off, and you can agree or disagree, but he's sort of convincing, right?
I mean, even with some like Allama Tabatabai, I think
there you go.
He kind of holds back. So when you actually look at the more irfani aspects of his work, none of those are actually directly written by him. They're kind of being reported from his classes. So sometimes it's a bit more difficult to get a sense of how he was presenting himself in the seminary. But I mean, this wider question of the legitimacy, so to speak, of Irfan, the contestation of Irfan often goes alongside the contestation of philosophy, because by this point, philosophy is associated with Mullah Sadr.
Yes.
And so, in effect, you've got a convergence of hikmat and irfan anyway.
You do.
In terms of how it's received. But then, coming back to Tusi, what about that? Because, yes, you can teach the tajreed. I don't think anyone will necessarily object to people teaching the tajreed or the kashf al-murad in the seminary.
Yeah.
But is it really an important element of what's going on? There certainly is a very long tradition of tajreed commentary and marginalia and so forth. But does it really still exist in the same way? And how do we really kind of make sense of what the tajreed is today?
I mean, I don't know. My understanding is to recent seminarians whom I'm cross paths with, that they actually, they leave out this whole part. They don't do they don't do al-maqsad al-awwal, right? And they don't do the second one, and they basically jump straight into al-maqsad al-thani fil jawhar al-a'rad. So they jump right into the third, which is fi ithbat as-sana wa sifat, right? So that's al-ilahiyat bil-ma'na al-khas. So they leave out the major part, and this is with the Kashf al-Murad. So that's most of the book, which is basically Avicenna metaphysics. They jump into this, and they love to look at the chapter on imama, which is very nicely done. So I really wonder. And there have been a couple people who I've met who said, well, a lot of this stuff is irrelevant now. Because, he talks about the doctrine of the soul, for example. And so I think maybe some modern contemporary people are enamored of modern notions of psychology. But also he talks about the Ptolemaic model, epicycles, if you know what those are. If you want to mathematically model the movements of the heavens as seen by a person on the earth, and so you assume that things go around the earth, there's something called retrograde motion, which is the apparent backward movement of a planet, which really you can only explain by the heliocentric system, because some of these planets are further away, and then when we move, it seems like they're going backward, but they're not, because the orbits don't align. And so to come up with an explanation for this in a Ptolemaic model, you have to introduce another circular motion around just an empty point. And that's known as the Ptolemaic epicycles, and there's the things called equants and deferents, and al-Tusi was an expert in all of this. In fact, he's famous for something called the al-Tusi couple. And the mathematics and the geometry is fascinating, but that's in here. And so people say, well, why do we need this? Why do we need the doctrine of substance and accident? And why do we need, there's the ancient doctrine of motion is also there. And in Arabic, it's called al-harakatul qasriya, which you could translate as forced motion. There isn't this is before Galileo and all of his bid'ahs, his innovations. And so there's a completely different understanding. And so I think in the minds of some people, they will think this is completely unnecessary and we should just eject this. But people who say this don't really have an education, excuse me for being so, and I don't mean to belittle these individuals, but they do not have a modern education in modern mathematics and modern physics and so forth. And they are very impressed by the achievements of modern technology, airplanes and iPhones and, all this kind of stuff that is around us. And so they somehow think that this is superior, but they don't, the fact seems to be lost on them that even modern science is built on some sort of a metaphysics and metaphysical understanding. There's a tremendous change between, what is before Galileo, and then of course Newton and Descartes. It's totally different. The notion of motion, the notion of mass, the notion of force, these are absolutely transformed with Newton. And I don't really think they get that. And they think that the scientific method, al-manhaj al-tajribi, the experimental method is sort of the be-all and the end-all of things, and it's not.
And it's also, it's fundamentally misunderstands the way in which metaphysics has not disappeared, but has merely been transformed. And some of it is merely like a sort of semantic shift. So, most people, there are a few exceptions, but most people don't talk about substances and accidents and essences and so forth, right?
Well, I think
in
the
the Aristotelian sense. But they talk about individuals and properties. And there's no huge difference between substance and accidents and individuals and properties.
Well, there's a very important book in this regard by David Oderberg, who is a kind of Thomist, neo-Thomist, whatever you want to call him, called Real Essentialism. It was not an easy read, but it's a very interesting book. I think it's a very important book. And, when modern science dispenses with formal cause and final cause and leaves you with material cause and efficient cause, So when you've gotten rid of al-illat al-suriyya and al-illat al-gha'iyya, and you leave yourself al-illat al-maddiyya and al-illat al-fa'iliyya or al-fa'il, the agent,
It's,
that's a
it's
mess.
physicalism.
It's physicalism on
Yeah.
one, but it's also, what is the justification? I mean, what is a physical law? What is a natural law? The claim that the scientific method is the only means to knowledge is not a claim that can be justified through the scientific method. These are metaphysical claims.
Yeah.
And so you can't get away
It's
from
not
metaphysics.
falsifiable as well.
You can't get away from metaphysics. And if even modern science in this form, if it is to have any meaning, what they are actually doing is looking at substance. So these kind of facts, if I may say so, are lost on a lot of these seminarians. And again, why would they be acquainted with this? They haven't. So I think they wrongly want to, shall we say, throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to those chapters of the Tajrid and think, the only important stuff is the Imama stuff and the, Ma'ad stuff, presumably.
And I guess part of it is also kind of this sort of oblivion of the history, because if you look at the vast majority of the commentaries on the Tajrid, not just the three famous commentaries, of course Hilli here, but then you've got the Isfahani and then later the Fushti, right? Most of the actual bulk of the material is on the first 2 or 3 sections.
Precise.
And a lot of the marginal commentaries are only on those. So even like, I think one of the best commentaries is actually, Jafar Astarabadi in the 19th century. The Al-Barahin Al-Sata, right?
Yeah, the one published by Bustan.
There's like 4 or 5.
I have that. Yes. That is very well done.
So if you remember correctly, like it's only a fifth of that which is on Nubuwwah, Imamah, and
you're
Ma'ad.
Absolutely right.
Most of it's on the other stuff.
Yeah, because the other stuff is a lot easier, I think.
But that's where the debates were really happening.
That's where the debates were happening.
I mean, in many ways, there's no new debate on Imamah. There's very little kind of moving on issues around Ma'ad or what prophecy is and what the nature of miracles is. I mean, there's a really one thing I've been fascinated always with the Tajrid, and I've never found this in the commentaries really a satisfactory thing to say, is when Tusi talks about the arts and the sort of hidden knowledge or hidden sciences which the Prophet teaches, right? I've never come across a commentary which actually explains this very well. And even Hilli says something like, what that really means is we wouldn't know how to write and we wouldn't know how to kind of do agriculture, so simple kind of technique things. But it must be more than that. It can't just be like craft. It must be more than craft.
Well, I mean, traditionally it was believed that these things go back to usually Idris, right?
Yes.
Or some
I know, but it's
ancient
but it's interesting
prophet.
that in the list of the functions of the Prophet, this is quite prominent.
Yeah.
And yet no commentary really does a very good job of explaining it.
Well, I mean, there's room for your own commentary now.
No, but I mean, it's interesting because it's about how you then. I mean, one of the things I think which is interesting about the Tajrid and texts like this is it's about a holistic approach, right? So the metaphysics is a foundation for how you talk about prophecy, how you talk about Imamah, and then how you talk about Ma'ad as a sort of eschatological culmination of this. Yeah. And so, the functions of the Prophet and their teaching and how you establish that, and then how that continues with the Imams has to be based on a certain metaphysics.
Precisely.
And that's why, you can't pick and choose. You can't just do this bit.
No, you can't.
Because there's a whole, it's a bit like, to use a simpler example.
Yeah.
Al-Bab al-Hadi Ashar of Hilli.
Yes.
Which is a very short text. Again, people often just look at little bits of it. But the text makes no sense unless you read the whole thing. Because only when you read the whole thing, you understand what the metaphysical foundation is and what the theme which unites the whole thing is. And the theme which unites the whole thing is Lutf, the concept of Lutf. Because that's what ties together the divine justice with the need of prophecy, the need of imamah, and the need for why eschatology happens the way it does.
Well, lutf is a very difficult book, difficult word to translate.
Yeah.
How do you render lutf? What's your?
I mean, the standard ones are like facilitating grace or whatever. I mean, the problem with
grace is so Christian.
It has very heavy baggage associated to it. But it's the idea of something which is a providential free gift from God.
What would you think of the subtle distillation of mercy for lutf?
Well, lutf, of course, is directly associated with mercy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like, and I mean that would potentially bring us back to al-Arabi.
It would.
and the pivotal role of mercy as, you know, the most important name in many ways.
It is in our tradition as well. Right?
Yeah. So, so I mean, in a sense, this is a different kind of conversation about how a seminarian really should be trained.
It is, yeah.
But certainly the idea that we do need more holistic approaches to these sorts of studies, and if you read a text, you should read the whole text. I think so. Which unfortunately is pretty much gone. And you know, it's rare to find people who even stick through. So even, you know, you think about these big classes, you know, Javad Yamulu teaching the Asfar or whatever over, what was it, 10 years or something like that.
Oh, my Lord, yeah.
How many people really stuck through it for the whole 10 years?
Yeah, sure.
You know, and how many people actually read the text through? Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I hadn't thought about this when we were originally planning this, but the link between Ibn Arabi and Tusi is a really good one.
It's a really important link, and I think it does come through the tajreed. And I think that the tajreed al-i'tiqad with, you know, I think it's hands down the most important commentary, at least the one that everyone should begin with, is Kashf al-Murad by al-Allama al-Hilli. I really think that the tajreed is the most important theological text in the history of Islam. And I am not being hyperbolic when I say this, because if you actually look, even, and when I say all of Islam, I mean our Sunni brethren as well,
because it's a very important text in the commentary tradition.
No, it changes the whole equation, or it changes the whole debate, or the whole game, or the whole situation, because let's go way back. You've got the Ash'aris and you've got the Mu'tazilis, and Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari writes a very sort of rudimentary work called Al-Ibana an Usul al-Diyana, which is basically just scriptural citations and a kind of scriptural theology, deeply, deeply influenced by Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And then there's another text which, you know, some people claim it's not his, and, you know, like this more sort of didactic and Burhan-based Ash'ari Kalam, which comes later. You know, like, I think it's Richard Franke had all these papers on the Luma. I think that's the work. It's been a while. And then you have the Mu'tazili and Sharh al-Usul al-Khamsa and so forth. And then in Sunni world, you also had Abu Bakr al-Baqillani. He's before al-Ghazali, he's for something.
Yeah, so he's the kind of...
And he has a Tamheed.
Yeah.
And then you've got Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, al-Ghazali's teacher. He has a book called Kitab al-Irshad, not to be confused with the Shia work of the same name on another topic. But these are not works that are still studied today.
No.
They and, you know, actually in the Sunni world, they have much later texts, like in Al-Azhar, they read stuff like Jawharat al-Tawheed by Ibrahim al-Laqani or something. But the really serious books in theology in the Sunni world was really Adl al-Din al-Iji's Kitab al-Mawaqif. And then you also got its Tawali al-Anwar, I think, fi Sharh Matali al-Anvar. Qadi al-Baydawi. And these are very sort of closely related works, but if you actually look at the Mawaqif by Adl al-Din al-Iji, it's after Kashf al-Murad, and the structure is very similar. They are responding to, it's not only you have Sunni scholars like Al-Isfahani in Tasdeed who writes, you know, there are Sunni commentators on the Tajreed, but there is a reaction to that. And so they start writing Mawaqif. So really, if on the Shia side you've got the Tajreed with the Kashf al-Murad, you've got Al-Iji's Mawaqif with various commentators, and all sorts of other people emerged, like Jurjani, and but what is the catalyst to that? What is the efficient cause? It's the writing of the
and
tajweed.
even when
in that sense, I say sorry, just to that's why I say that it's the most important and influential theology or kalam text in the history of Islam.
I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, just by the sheer volume of the commentaries and the marginalia.
Huge.
It's I don't think we even have a full listing of how many there are.
No, we don't. That's those Islam guys, the very nice volume which you brought for me from Istanbul.
It's nicely done, but it's not even.
It's a huge list, but I think those guys have. I mean, we haven't even scratched the surface. There's so many works that remain in manuscript. There's works that are uncatalogued. There's stuff lying around in India, in who knows, in Central Asia, and collections all over the place, and even stuff in Istanbul which hasn't been catalogued.
Yeah.
Right.
And even when you look at, if you take the tradition all the way up to Abdul, at the end of the 19th century. So, of course, he famously wrote a commentary on the Nasafiyya, right? And
Al-Aqaid al-Nasir.
Yeah. Or is Nasafiyya or the Adadiyya? It's basically on Dawani on, I think it's the Adadiyya, actually.
I didn't know this. Muhammad Abdu.
Yeah. And, there's a bit of a question mark about whether he wrote or Afghani wrote it, because
Astrabadi, Afghani.
Asadabadi, yeah.
Sorry.
But, I mean, certainly those texts, and when you look at those lithographs, which were published like around the turn of the 20th century, I mean, those sorts of debates make no sense unless you have the tajweed and the commentary tradition on it.
Yeah.
Because, those texts are supposed to be creedal, right? Commentaries and creeds, but they're not commentaries and creeds. They're full-blown theological, philosophical texts which come back to the sorts of issues which are raised here.
That's what I find really strange about the Sunni Muslims today, that they seem blissfully unaware of all this. Like, everyone has jumped on the Ibn Taymiyyah bandwagon, and they've got like
apart from the Turks. So I mean, I think the Turks are very interested in reviving that tradition and also reviving the Maturidi tradition, which is of course
that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah. What is perhaps a bit disappointing is that in South Asia that's not being done, and in other parts of so even like and then if you go further east, if you look at Southeast Asia, then their conception of kalam theology goes a bit earlier, so they're more just in the early Ash'ari stuff and not the later one. So
but anyway, South Asia is just depressing on you.
I mean,
it's just fallen so far. When we go back to India, Pakistan, Lucknow, it's so disappointing. And if you go to the Nadwat al-Ulama library in Lucknow, there's some amazing works there, but nobody reads these things, and it's just become so...
I mean, especially since there's such a rich intellectual heritage and manuscript tradition in these places as well.
Huge.
So, I mean, I guess almost a lost point.
Please. Sure.
So these are all good reasons for saying, first of all, we need a good edition and translation of the Fusus in one volume.
Yeah, why don't you sponsor it and I'll work on it? Yeah, so I can stop.
And the second one is we also need a good edition and translation of the Tajweed in one volume.
Well, I've got that.
Okay.
I've got the
That's
Tajweed.
Two things.
Yeah.
But also, I think what is
not
needed,
published yet.
What is needed is in the vein of Cambridge Companions, we need companion volumes to these as well. So, companion volume on the Fusus, which would be thematic, but would also be like, what about the reception here and in the Shia context and in the Ottoman context in South Asia? And the same thing with the Tajweed. What about, what happens to the metaphysics of the Tajweed? Why, what are the classic question about the creation of the cosmos, in which there seem to be two positions, in two different parts of the Tajweed. This whole question of what is the afterlife of the Tajweed. So this is what we need to do. We need to do these two editions.
You approach Cambridge and we'll do it.
And we need to do like a Cambridge companion to the Fusus and a Cambridge companion to the Tajweed.
That's a fantastic idea. Bismillah Kareem.
Okay, we'll do that.
With the name of Allah, let us begin.
Okay,
that is great.
Okay. Well, I think we should wrap it up there, but we could, of course, talk for much longer, but
we could.
But thank you again.
It was a
Sayyidna.
Pleasure. I really appreciate it, Sayyidna.
And I hope, once we do those things, we can have a further conversation about why these are important and why people should go out and buy them.
Inshallah. Yes, we will do that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and hopefully you can join us in the next episode of the Insight Interviews.